Welcome to Don and Steve Plus, and at least I am happy to have as our plus one this morning,
He's
Phil
my
Herndon.
favorite.
Your favorite?
Oh,
Well,
okay.
he's one of my favorites too.
Well,
So,
wow.
Do I have
we
to?
are-
I guess I have to qualify that because I do have a lot of people I love. You were definitely top of the list.
Okay.
Yeah, well, Man Ministries,
That
if
works.
you want to find out more about Phil. But I'm glad you're here because I had something happen to me not that long ago that I'm like, oh, I want to talk to Phil about this.
Oh,
I want to
wait.
see. Yeah. So I'm having this conversation with my oldest. She's 26. She lives like 800 miles away, and I happen to be nearby for work. And I'm like, we got to grab dinner. So she's like, yeah, let's do that. And we're just kind of talking, catching up on life, seeing what's going on. And she starts sharing and opening up a little bit about some of the difficult things that happened in her childhood that up to that point I was not aware of. Maybe had suspicions of, but I'm like, I didn't know that happened. I didn't know that was a thing. And, many of these things happened outside of my care, right? But you hope that your kid is not going to have to walk through some different traumas and things like that. And I remember thinking, as I'm learning these things, I'm like, I so wish I could have protected you from that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you shouldn't have had to walk through some of these things. And I'm sorry that happened, and I'm sorry that you weren't protected from that. And the parent guilt was very real.
Yeah.
Phil. And I think a lot of parents, the stories may be different.
Yeah.
The circumstances your kids walked through and the ways that you tried to help and didn't, or just didn't help or weren't even aware. Like, the stories may be different, but I think a lot of us may deal with some sort of parent guilt. And so I'm like, I wonder what Phil thinks about how do we cope with and learn to live with and move on in a very healthy way from the parent guilt that many of us are probably carrying.
Yeah, that. Do you have any easy questions? By the way? No, that, man, I think as long as humans raise humans, be a lot of parent guilt around. I have it too, for sure. And I remember I was talking to my son before he was married, and they had done some premarital work, some wise. And I wasn't ready for, hey, Dad, some of my own stories shook loose during that. Oh, good to know. Wow, look over there.
Like, wow.
Okay. So that was my time for parent guilt and other times as well. And I think one of the most important things we can do as parents is accept the fact I'm going to have parent guilt. Guilt is a feeling, we talked about this earlier, that guilt's a feeling that occurs when I've caused harm, and every parent has caused harm because we are humans raising humans. And so I think one of the most important things we can do is go ahead and accept, like, yes, I have parent guilt to be able to accept. And one of the things that has been so helpful for me as a parent, as I've been mentored by other men, I didn't know a whole lot, experientially at least, about parenting when I became a parent from my own story.
Yeah.
And so I had some really godly men, Steve, that walk with me that had raised, in particular, sons, and some had raised daughters too. But that was so helpful for me just to hear that from other dads. Like, oh, yeah, I did that and I did that. So I think the first step to dealing with parent guilt is saying, okay, it is literally a universal condition because I have sinned against my children and caused harm, and as have they against me and caused harm, and that's what they're going to do too. And so that doesn't mean it doesn't matter, and it doesn't mean to be cavalier and careless. But I think one of the first steps is what you just did, is to have a conversation with somebody and go, hey, my daughter ran into some things, had to navigate some things. I wasn't there to help protect her from that. And I have a lot of feelings about that because I love her like crazy.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, yes. That protection piece when you find out later that you are unable to protect your kid. And and you want to fix it so badly and you can't, and that just sticks in your heart. And then you've got this perfectionism that sets up camp in some of us, where the one place you really want it to show in a good way is towards your kids.
Yes.
You don't want to offend them. You want to raise them well. You want to raise them to honor the Lord. And then you get on the flip side of that as they become adults, and you start to hear, remember, Mom, when you did that? And they're not even coming after me. Like, it's just may come up in conversation. When you did this, it hurt me. I just shrivel. Phil, I don't even know what to do with that. I don't mind when they hurt me. It hurts.
Yes.
But I would rather take that all day long than one moment of hurting them.
For sure. For sure. And with both of these examples, the beautiful thing with these examples is the most healing thing we can do is what you're talking about. And the most healing thing I could do was just hear what he had to say about what shook loose in his own story. And Steve, the fact that she even said that to you, so healing for her as a daughter. And there's so much to do with when I have caused harm, there's so much around dealing with my own hurt when someone brings it to me. There's something really, really healing about that as a child. One of the things that I run into 34 years of clinical practice, I don't think it's a stretch to say probably the most common fear, the core of the most common traumas around parenting guilt is when a person says to me, and one of two scenarios, I've never talked to them about these things because when I tried to when I was a child, I was met with something. Resistance, defensiveness, well, I guess I'm just the worst parent ever, self-pity, or a child who now may be in his or her 50s or 60s says one thing that never occurred. First of all, they didn't listen to me, and they never said they were sorry. They never said, or if the words aren't even spoken, just to say, man, I missed it. I'm sorry I missed it. And if I had to do over again, I would sure not miss it. I'd miss other stuff, but I wouldn't miss this. And there's something so healing because in the reverse, I have heard that for over 3 decades. The pain of not being heard, the pain of not having an opening to say what your kids have said to you, what your daughter said to you, Steve, and or the dynamic of the parent says, I will not accept that. I will not say, yes, I'm really sorry.
I think it's in some ways easy to say I'm really sorry because I genuinely am.
Yeah.
What I think sometimes is hard about that is like when it was beyond, in one sense, beyond your control.
Yes.
The trauma and different things happen outside of your direct care, and your child has walked through this pain, and you weren't able to help them navigate that or to protect them from that. But yet at the same time, you had no idea.
Yes.
That was going on at that point. And so for the parent who's like, Phil, I wasn't the abuser. I wasn't the one who did this directly to my kids. Yet at the same time, as a parent, I'm supposed to be their protector.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to be their provider, and I'm supposed to be their fill in the blank, whatever, however you want to do that. And that didn't happen. But I didn't know. And so there's a tension in that how do you help navigate some of that?
Yeah, that's where another super important word comes in, and it's powerlessness. It's really common words to use, and so often, especially in the emotional realm, we'll get in this kind of this lane that says, "Oh well, I can only feel one thing about this, and that's it." So I guess I'll feel guilty for what this happened. And that yes, there is the harm that was done by your not knowing or not being available couldn't be there. And then there's these other feelings like the profound sadness and like what people need when they're in their own grief. Any child, if the child's 30, doesn't matter, 20, whatever, when a child comes to a parent and says something like that, like, hey, Dad, this is something that happened to me and it was really painful, or Mom, that kind of thing. When that parent can join them in their grief, because what a child is doing, maybe not only grief, sometimes it's anger as well, but sometimes it's just the raw grief of something having happened and you weren't there to help me. And so when we join our children in the grieving process, they receive comfort. Comfort's a beautiful word. It really means to fortify. Like the suffix of comfort means fortification. And so when I'm strengthening, you were strengthening her by joining her in your grief. So you had some guilt of harm was caused by my absence. But mostly what it sounds like she was pinging off of with you, Steve, is her dad was entering into her grief with her. Your sadness around what happened, your feelings about not being there, and then sometimes a really evil part of shame that comes from an evil enemy will point the pointy finger at you and say, you shoulda, you're this, you're that, and will begin to define you. And you will forget the gift that both of you have gotten through you entering her sadness with her about what you missed.
Mm-hmm.
That shoulda, though, it goes almost every time it's firing at you with what I should have done. And I know it just comes part of the sentence structure.
Yes.
Is that should is in there. I carry with me so much of the spiritual formation. There was something that the Lord just kept laying on my, so no pressure, Phil. The Lord kept laying it on my heart, and here we are, and I never followed through. But the guilt that comes with that, yes, I have talked to the Lord. Yes, you take it back to him for sure, because he's the one that guided. But just like a Bible study with the kids while they were in high school, and I just kept having it put on my heart to just invite the young ladies. Like, they can say no, they can say yes, do something simple. It doesn't. And because my kid went to a Christian school, they had Bible, they had chapel. There was so much when we would talk about it. It was like, yeah, but we get this all the time, Mom. And then we go to church. And then and so I was sensitive to that because I wanted it to really be something that was meaningful in their walk, not just like academic or I have to do this. And I guess, do you just have to keep taking that back to the Lord until he kind of relieves your heart of that guilt? Because that's guilt and shame all over again.
That's right.
I should have. Lord, I know you told me. I would have, but I didn't. I didn't.
Yeah. And parenting, any parent knows, like, it's a 27-hour-a-day job because there's 3 hours worth of stuff you're not going to get in a 24-hour day. We're just going to miss so many things. And what's beautiful about what both of you are talking about is we're pretty good about going, man, I raised my voice, or I wish I'd let them do this, or wish I'd said no, all those things. But what you two are talking about lies at such a root of some of the things that dog us as Christ-following parents, what we didn't do. It's like, yes, we didn't do that. And I've had that conversation too. Like, I was a pastor and taught, not in a grad school or anything, but taught hermeneutics, taught all those things. And my wife and I had the conversation. Like, I don't have many memories of sitting at a table teaching my own son that. Taught a lot of other sons and daughters that, but not my own. And so I didn't see that, didn't catch it, didn't do it. And so what you two are talking about, I believe, is more wounding, because we're pretty good, like I said, about going, man, I did that, I'm sorry. Or but it's like, oh man, the things that I didn't catch or didn't see or didn't do or put off, and now it's too late. That brings the grief piece back into these conversations, because so much of what we will call under the umbrella of parent guilt really is parent regret and sadness. It's like, I so wish I had discipled my son in a way more intentional manner, because he was part of a great youth group and he loved his youth pastor, and we were at a Bible-believing, Bible-teaching church, and I was one of the ones up there doing a lot of it. Right. And so, oh, sure, he's fine. And now I guess he is fine, but man, what I miss to be able to do that with him, that he could do that with his dad. Was really a big miss. And so I think you two really are intuitively pushing into a whole lot of what parenting and dealing with what parent guilt we have is what I missed, what I didn't step into that I wish I would have.
One of the things that I have heard counselors say over and over and over again is, regardless the age of your kids, in a sense, it's not too late to go back and fix some certain things and to mend maybe some broken fences and bridges and whatever. Yet at the same time, it might be too late to do exactly what you're talking about, to go back and do some of that discipling that could have happened under your roof.
Yeah.
A lot of our kids have, in a sense, kind of moved on. Some of them are raising their own families at this point. And you're like, I would love to be able to go back and say, could we do this? We probably can't. But is there ever a place for like, okay, maybe we can't go back and I can't disciple you the way I would have when you were 14, 16, 18. But now that you're 35, 40, busy with your own family, have you ever seen anybody re-engage well in that sort of scenario?
Man, I had you till you said, well. Man, you blew it, Steve. Oh, we were so close. You almost did it. Yeah. I'm kind of kidding about that, kind of not. Lots of attempts, and I'm not throwing shade at people that have done that, but it really is, and that's where we've had previous podcasts around boundaries. That really is where I would run the risk, I feel, would run the risk of moving in and like really wanting, like you need to do this, pushing into and, getting in the middle of his life that he has in order for him to make up for what I missed. And maybe there are opportunities, because most of us who have children who are raising their own families, the nest is pretty much empty, if not empty, could have that opportunity to do that and to ask the Lord, like, are these some of the years you would restore that the locusts of my putting things off ate? Could you do that? And so, but often where that falls off the rails, when you said well, is so often people with all the right reasons in terms of wanting to make up for lost time, it'll end up being, no, you, my grown child, you have to do this so I can make up for what I missed. And that's what they can begin to smell, to go, I don't know if this is about discipleship or penance. Like we need to decide what this is.
Yeah. That's such an interesting point, and to pray and ask the Lord, which way am I going here? Is this just to make me feel better? And that's parenting no matter what. I know we're talking about parenting guilt as the kids get older, and maybe that relationship has shifted as they become in charge of their own world. But you think about when the kids are little too. Oftentimes we're still looking for them to validate our feelings.
Oh, yeah.
I remember a time when the oldest was in 5th grade, and part of her story is we held her in 5th grade. I'd started her young, and I had asked the whole time, should I have done that? Should I have done that? And the circumstances, the Lord just made it clear that we were supposed to do that when we had moved to Tennessee. And when we told her, of course, it did not go over super well.
I would imagine.
It was not her favorite day.
I bet.
It was not. And I remember as she was very upset, and she was saying some things to me that really hurt my feelings. And I was grateful the Lord said, this is not about you, Dawn Ray May. Keep your mouth shut at this point. And then the next thing I remember saying is, Lord, this was your idea. You got to fix this. And he moved in her heart to where there was a youth camp that Lifeway or all of them were doing, and it was a sports youth camp through church. And she was like, well, at least I can go to Central Kid another year, because she was going to age out. And I'm like, there it is, Lord. There it is.
Yes.
There it is. But I remember in the moment of her yelling at me and, being very unhappy with me, that I wanted to defend myself. And I wanted to make it okay because I wanted to be okay.
Yes.
And that's a hard moment when we're looking for our children to validate us.
Yes. Yes. That's one of the things that we can so easily fall into, because when we catch, I missed that, but here's a way to not miss it again. And what they will end up in, that is the nexus of a whole lot of what we call later on in life performance anxiety. My son, my daughter has to act in a certain way or do a certain thing in a certain way, so I don't have to carry the feelings I'm having about what I'm missing.
Oh, I'm sorry. You weren't asking for volunteers to experience that?
I do see that hand, yes.
I'm so sorry. I thought that was a question. Like, who here has... Okay, no.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry, keep going.
My hand will be up too. And so that's where we get into this whole territory. We're never going to do it just right. And you look at Scripture, and there's so many direct statements about parenting, what parenting really is. I mean, of all the examples Jesus could use, when these guys are, man, their lives, 3 years just up and down, and what in the world is going on? They're in disequilibrium half the time, and they're like, Jesus, you speak in circles, these metaphors, we don't understand it. Jesus says, that is correct. Keep struggling. And and then all this stuff happens, and then he says, man, guys, what a ride. Hey, I'm leaving. Just so you know, I'm taking off here, but it's for your good. And they're like, what? Yeah. And when they're clearly like they're astir, like Jesus says, hey, listen, I'm not going to leave you as orphans. Of all the things he could have used, orphans. And then when he describes the work of the Holy Spirit, his own Spirit, when he describes that, what are parents called to do? Guide, convict, tell kids what the truth is, advocacy. It's like, oh, wait a minute. He's laying out what the perfect parent is going to do in the life of the believer. And part of what he does is he advocates in groanings that cannot be uttered. And a lot of those groanings are going to be about being a parent. And so Paul, and we mentioned Paul in a previous podcast, like he uses very, very maternal language with the Thessalonians, with the Galatians. And so we see these examples. God says, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. Your walls are ever before me. I could no more forget you than a nursing mother can forget her baby. And so all through Scripture, clearly being a parent is a big deal to God. Therefore, the enemy is going to be very active in the hearts of parents to go, Steve Hiller, I can't believe you missed, and all this stuff. And, and so we have to keep in mind, I think, that biblically speaking, God knowing our humanness and has still, in his sovereignty and in his providence, chosen for humans to raise humans. And so we go back to this parental heart of God, this maternal and paternal heart of God to say, okay, I am your child and you are my parent. And how do I relate to you? And how do I transfer that to these kids, even if they're 30 or 40 or so? And that's an easy prescription to give. And however, if we will pay attention to what God's word says in that paternal and maternal language, it can be really comforting. And we can come to our children, if we have access to them, and say to them, there's some things that I missed. It is not your job to make up for that, and you don't have to do anything with this. I need you to hear me say, I know that. And if I've missed some things on my miss list, you fill in the gaps. And let's just have whatever conversations you need about that. It is remarkable how healing that is for the child. Y'all know, worked in the treatment world for years. And when parents and our guys were I say guys because we had a men's treatment center, but our men were up in age. We didn't do adolescents, and most of our guys were professionals, so they were 40s, 50s, some of them 60s. And when a parent came to town in their 70s or 80s, that parent would sit and say, I just want to know, what did I miss? I am all ears. Man, those guys, some of them famous and some of them powerful, some of them this and that, those guys turned into 7-year-old boys finally being able to tell mom and dad what it was like. Wow. Beautiful things to see. And so in some ways, in God's grace, sometimes it is too late for different situations, but I have seen it repeatedly where a parent comes to town, so to speak, and says something very simple like that, I want to listen to you. It's very, very powerful. Sometimes that's the most healing thing we can do with our guilt and our humanness.
A lot of times we may want to fix it in some way or make it up to them. Like, I missed it, and I don't want to miss it again, and I know I can't go back and fix it, but I want to make it up to you in some way. Yeah. Is there ever a time to ask that child, like, what would it look like for me to show you that I have that regret and I want to try and make it up to you in some way?
Yes, I think that's a beautiful offer. And we've talked earlier before about invitation, and I think those are important. Man, what acts of grace they are when we're able to do that. And when the child goes, well, you know what? Yeah, if you came around more, or if when we were together, I got to tell a little bit of my story and not just yours, that'd be great, Dad, Mom. Sometimes those open doors when the parent comes kind of sort of empty-handed to say, no obligation necessarily for my own healing, but man, I miss so much and I would love to make that up. Sometimes you'll hear an athlete ends up, not common, but sometimes the story is, Dad was in prison or Dad was away or Dad was something. And what we love about those stories is now the dad's in the stands watching his now grown son play football or baseball or whatever. And we love those, we call them human interest stories. Well, they're human interest stories because, wow, I get to see a picture of a son and a dad come back together, or a son and a mom come back together and making up for lost time. Though we can't literally do that, there is something healing about saying, if there's something I can do or a way I can be, I would love to do that. Which is a great segue, kind of, I think, into how God's grace acts in a succeeding generation.
Explain that.
Well, there's, it's funny to go, and I'm pretty sure, my daughter-in-law is pregnant and due in May. So it's probably going to be said by my son, the line, these are not the people that raised me. what happened to my parents?
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And so my parents said that about their parents. I thought, my grandparents are perfect. What's your problem? And so sometimes we get these acts of grace. And again, there's all kinds of context around this. I understand that my son and daughter-in-law and my coming granddaughter live in our town, so we have to be careful with boundaries. So I'm not talking about just the Wild West, but when these things are worked through and talked through, it can be such a blessing for me to pour into grandchildren what I didn't, what I missed for whatever reason into the children, not to make up for that, but to say, man, the Lord has granted another generation that carries my DNA that I'm going to miss things with him and her too, for sure. But it may not be the same things. And so again, that's a nuanced conversation, but at the same time, there's a reason that grandparents are so beloved in so many ways. It's because something in that grandparent says, I don't want to miss it this time.
Yeah. It's true. We learn. We learn. Hopefully we learn. If we're looking at an adult child though, and there's a tension in that relationship, and we realize as a parent we miss these things, the guilt is difficult.
Yes.
What should we know about the vulnerability it's going to take to go to that adult child, bare our souls, or say we're sorry, and maybe the adult says, yep, thanks, see ya.
Uh-huh.
There's a risk there that seems so big. And would you say go for it anyway, or what would you?
Those stories abound, sadly.
Sure.
So they happens all the time, and we may as well talk about it.
Yep.
So yes, the short answer. And when we go for it, there's an analogy that when there's a confrontation, like in treatment or in therapy or something, there's a confrontation, equipping the person that's doing the confrontation to say, when you do this, we so hope it turns out really beautifully. When you go into the confrontation, be sure you're paying attention to how possible it is that it may not. Mm-hmm. And so do the confrontation when you need to speak it, and whatever comes back at you may not be what you wanted. When you're ready to contain that, that can be a really beautiful thing, and that's another boundary conversation too. So that's the one aspect of that. And then the other is when we are met with a child an adult child that says, yeah, you really did miss that. Here's an important concept. We're going to go back to neuroscience for a second. Content is reliably inaccurate. So a lot of times, because the way the brain works, this part of the brain that's taking in data, the brain's super efficient. And so it flushes things it doesn't need. And we flush details all the time. And so what can so get off the rails, and when I coach people around confrontation, like if you can pay far more attention to the impression that relationship left on your son or daughter, and please do not split hairs around content. Just understand do neuroscience 101, the limbic impression of that relationship is stuck in your child's brain. The content may be very different than what you remember. And so if you can even lay that out to say, I love you, I want to be back in good, healthy, intimate relationship with you. Part of that's going to be we might remember things differently. And so that's called content, sweetheart. And so we remember things differently. I want you to know my aim for this conversation is that we get on the same page relationally. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean anything other than that, but sometimes it is so tempting to want to go, that's not how that happened. No, wait a minute. And that's where the child goes, this is Groundhog Day. We already did this. It's called 18 years of being at home. That doesn't mean the parent's always at fault, quote unquote. A lot of nuance there too. But so often we will, when we're in a confrontation of some kind or a hard conversation, we'll want to jump over to that left brain and get the power of being right about the content. And we will miss the opportunity to relate heart to heart.
Mm. When the parent finally decides that they're willing to take that risk and they think that they can contain whatever that response is. As you say, you hope for the best.
Yeah.
But it doesn't always go that way. I would imagine that sometimes what you get back is a whole lot of anger. You went from a potentially civil relationship, hoping to deepen that relationship, and what it feels like is you just potentially destroyed that relationship because of what came back at you. For the parent who tries something along these lines and what they get back is not, oh, Dad, oh, Mom, thank you for saying that. Thank you for let's build that bridge. But no, you're right. You did all that and worse. And let me tell you, and da-da-da. And next thing you know, you are absolutely unloaded on.
Yes.
What's the best way to take that?
Again, any hard questions you should want to throw my way to that? No, that, and sadly, again, one more topic we probably need to talk about it because that is as or more common than the other. Yeah. And so what's happening there? We've talked about this before around fear. When it's an unloading, it's anger with a pretty good mixture of rage in there, and rage's origin is terror. And so sometimes it's good to play the long game as a parent. You may, because people that are raging are terrified of being harmed. Think about, I know y'all have beloved pets at home, but if your beloved pet is injured, there's a chance that if you go over, you'll get growled at, barked at, or bitten by that. Well, the pet's not mad at you. The pet's afraid of being hurt more. And so sometimes when this happens and it's we'll just say a 30-year-old child, the 30-year-old child certainly is angry, but what you're getting back is more the rage and the terror. Oh, no, you're going to hurt me again. Once again, limbic. They can't hear the content, the left brain, because the right brain is so activated. Here sits the man, here sits the woman that did me so much harm or did me or neglected me or whatever the thing may be. And so the first run may be, yes, anger. I'm angry. That should not have happened the way it did. But the rage fuels the anger coming out because what I'm actually doing is I'm looking at your face. I've had a life with you, and I'm terrified I'm going to be hurt again. And so we can go into those meetings and say, if this adult child, unloads like that, can play the long game, if I can contain, I don't want to be abused, I'm going to be harmed and hit, of course, but if I can contain and recognize, okay, he or she is really terrified because they are really raging and they're scared to death. Like, okay, because I know I'm scared to death hearing it and seeing it.
Right.
And when that ends, and again, this is going to be different with every conversation, but when that part of the conversation ends, to be able to contain that and say, man, that really hurt, and I get it, and I would love for this to be continued if and when you're ever ready for it to be continued. Because the thing that calms rage, that calms fear, is for a simple little thing called presence. And if I can stay present, and again, with boundaries, not being harmed, attacked physically and otherwise, but if I can contain that from that child who is angry with me and raging at me as a result, and play that long game and build a bridge. Maybe this meeting is one slat. And I go, okay, one slat. Now there's a pretty big gulf still, but there's one slat. And if I can contain his anger or her anger, recognize it for that. And even to say back to them, hey, I know you got a lot of energy. I know you got a lot going on in there toward me. I heard every word. And when you're willing again, I want to talk some more. Back to that invitation piece. And so that's a super important question. And that's what's happening. It's terrifying to look at the face I have all these feelings about.
Can you speak to the adult child who would love to have that opportunity to speak to the parent, but the parent is either no longer with us or the parent is unable to have that conversation? They cannot contain.
Yes.
Mom, dad cannot contain what I'm going to need to say.
Yes.
What do you do with that? Because you carry that wounding and you try to find a place, especially as a believer. You give it to the Lord. You try to find a place for it. You try to not let it affect the rest of your relationships. And then it does.
Does it ever? Yeah, a couple of scenarios with that. And again, sadly, common. One is this practice called benign neglect, where if my parents are alive and I have access to them, but I really want, like the child really wants to come to the parent and lay some things out, and they realize like it's just dangerous, like he or she cannot contain that, then I maintain cordiality and kindness, and I talk about the weather and football and these other things, and I leave it at that. And then that means I have to grieve what I can't have with them that I wish I could. They're incapable of that conversation. Yeah. Secondly, there's an old saying in 12-step recovery that sometimes we have a family of choice that we have to have rather than a family of chance. We know it isn't chance, it's providence, but it rhymes. And so, the family of chance is and lots and lots of people have to deal with this. Like I find family other places. That's not my first choice. That's not a recommendation for me. Oh, just go find your own. Like I think it's worth the hard work. And sometimes no matter how hard I work, it can't happen. And so when it can't happen, I'll tell you a very quick story from my own life. I've told many times. I did not have a relationship like that with my dad. It was not close. We didn't talk in that way, and he passed away. And so the first Father's Day after his death, I was walking across our church auditorium, and a man in our church, still around, he was my age now then. Yeah. So young guy, and so walked across the auditorium. It was Father's Day. And he said, "Hey, Phil, how you doing?" I said, "Oh, I'm doing fine." He took me by the arm and he pulled me gently and he said, your face doesn't look like you're doing so great. And I said, I think it might be, my dad passed away last year, and I think this first Father's Day. He looked me square in the eye. I'll never forget it. He said, "Man, what an honor it would be to have you as a son." Whew. I'm about to do it now. I mean, Sheila came to the car, and she was like, "Are you okay?" And she goes, "Is this about your dad?" I said, "Yes, it actually is." And so I told the story that this man who I'd known for a little while, and that man to this day, that man's in our community group. I can't look across my living room every other Sunday and not think, that man loves me like a son. I know he's not my dad, and I know he can't really replace my dad, and he's also 20 plus years older than me. And when I look at him, I know he loves me that way because he told me completely unexpectedly. So again, family of choice, as the program calls it, that's not the best option. It's an option when all others are exhausted, and what a provision from God. When that child does have a figure in their life that is godly and loves them like a parent.
Yeah.
I live that every day.
Yeah.
That's so good. I'm looking at the clock, and unfortunately our time is pretty much gone, but I'd love just your final thoughts for the parent who is listening to this podcast and they're saying, "Yeah, I got that guilt. I know I need to deal with it. I want to, in a sense, deal with it, but it's scary to deal with that because of the feelings and the emotions that so far I've been able to kind of hit the mute button on or keep stuffed and keep quiet." What would you say to the parent who's like, I know it's in there, but I just don't know that I want to open that box?
Yes, and sometimes that's wisdom. First of all, like, you're back speaking, Steve, again about fear. Like, I fear opening that box. What will it do to me? What will it do to us? What will it do to us? So really fair question. Like, and so I think that's really the first stop. Like, what is my fear? What damage could be done? And then it sounds like a silly word to use, and then practice. Get a godly guy if you're a dad. Get a godly woman if you're a mom, and go, I want to practice a conversation I might have with my kid. And so just to let that person walk you along and say, hey, and give feedback and pushback and boundaries and encouragement. And sometimes the way we go about doing something is as important as what we do. And so to be able to have people that walk alongside the famous comment, children aren't afraid of the dark, they're afraid of the dark alone. Well, parents may not be afraid to have conversations. They may be afraid to have a conversation alone. And so simple things like, I'm talking to my friend Steve, I need to have a really hard conversation. I'm really afraid to talk to my son about this. And Steve and I hashed that thing out over several cups of coffee over a couple of months. And then when I go have that conversation with him, I call Steve on the phone the way, and like, you gonna be around in an hour or so, Steve? Yep. And I call him when I leave. And there's something very comforting in the human person, as the researchers say, in the human person, about knowing I walk into something hard and scary, not alone. And I walk out not alone. I come from somewhere and I'm going back to somewhere when I do this. And sometimes the most practical is the most beautiful. But very intuitively, it is so important to start with what my fears are. Like, could this cause damage that is worse than not talking about this at all? If the answer is yes, through gaining wisdom, then I talk to other people in my life about it. And I wish I could talk to them with.
It's interesting that practically, relationally, when we're having these interpersonal relationships, it's right along the lines of what the Lord has instructed us to do.
Yeah.
So if you're a believer, you don't walk alone because you have the Holy Spirit, and He's given you community.
Yes.
So that you can have iron sharpening iron.
Yes.
If you're not a believer, you still have the ability, the gift that God's given of other people.
Yes.
Which is interesting.
Amen. Isn't
that He still shows His grace as He draws us to Himself.
His parental care.
He's amazing. He's amazing. And the conversation has been amazing. I hope you've been encouraged by it. Don and Steve plus Phil Herndon, 10 Man Ministries. That's 10manministries.com. And we are so grateful for your wise counsel. Thank you for sharing that with us today. Oh, absolutely. We'll have you back. And meanwhile, if you would like and subscribe, we'd really appreciate that. Even share. If you've been encouraged today, share with someone. Don and Steve plus.